Hi. Well, after that little startup, we're going to jump right into today's lecture. So let me first share my screen here with you so you can see what I'm doing. I have to figure out where they moved it here. It's down here. That's comments. Hold on a second. I want to get rid of that. They moved my. That's for inviting people. Yeah, I know I'm a UI guy, but it doesn't help. Share screen. There we go. Okay, share my entire screen so you can see my slides. Great. All right, here we go. So welcome to today. Today is April 7th, and we've got two segments to today's class. So the first one is this. Let's just jump over here. And so just to check, I assume everybody can see my presentation, right? Okay. I'll assume that was a yes or head nodding or someone. So Pedro, if I suddenly go off microphone, you can't hear me, or they think it's your job to ping me and make sure everything's working.
Yes.
Okay, good. I heard you. That's great. Thank you. So, so today we got two parts. We've got this about the next 45 minutes or so. We're going to talk about rhythms and social capital and networks, sort of thinking about our bigger topic, and then for the second 45 minutes, we'll have a little bit of a break. Then for the second 45 minutes, we'll talk mostly about the data analysis project. Okay? So, welcome. We're here. Let's get going. Today we're going to talk about these four papers, but I suspect we're actually not going to get to the fourth paper today. But I will talk about it a little bit, and then we will probably revisit that next time. Our first paper here is really this top one. What can I expect from an email response? Yeah, it's about email, and I know most of you don't do email willingly, but the same concepts hold here as hold in any kind of social network, any kind of social media stuff. So it's an important first study in this sort of expecting a response and how people behave. The second one is a study of social capital on Facebook. And this, again, is another one from a couple years ago and sets up a whole bunch of work that we'll be talking about in the future. The third paper there, the Strength of Weak Ties, is sort of a classic. I don't know how many of you printed it out, but you might have noticed that it was a scanned copy of an old paper. But it's a really important paper, and I'll tell you why when we get there. And this last one here is Signed Networks. This is an important paper because it was the first paper that actually started analyzing social graphs in terms of both positive and negative relationships, because not everybody on Facebook is your friend, right? Sometimes you have people in your social network who are not so friendly. Anyway, we'll talk about all these. Okay, so let's get going here on this first paper. So this is this first one here is when can I expect an email response? Like I said, the point here is not so much about email as much as it is about patterns of activation or sending messages and getting responses. This is true for telephones, this is true for email, this is true for instant messages, this is true for Snapchat, whatever, right? You implicitly expect a reply. So what are those factors? What are the sort of the human social factors that play into this? So let's dive into this paper. Now, it's interesting to note that Joshua Tyler and John Tong were both at HP Labs at the time, and they were very much interested in how people at HP were using mail and what they could do to sort of help design a better email system. Okay? So first thing you got to realize, some human behaviors are incredibly periodic. Here's this incredible graph that I produced. This is the query frequency, the volume by day for the query full moon. And this works in German and it works in French. It doesn't matter what your language is. But notice this. This is actually over a little bit more than a year. Each of those spikes is the number of queries for the query full moon that happen on the full moon. Yeah. So what happens is that people, when they see a big moon in the sky, they start doing a query for it. And it drops a little bit in the winter time because you see that down part right here where it goes down? That's the winter, or at least it's a cloudy time of year. And so people don't see it. Anyway, whatever. Anyway, it's interesting to note that this is true for Google search queries, and it's true for lots of behavior online. It's true for Facebook posts. It's true for all this stuff. So let's talk about the special case of email. Now, if you see this chart, this is an incredibly busy chart, but the thing to notice here is that this is time going basically from 4 in the morning, see over here on the far left side, 4 in the morning to 7:30, 8 at night. So this is one day, or rather, one 24-hour cycle. Now this is work by the same authors. You see John Tong there again? Bo Begole and Randy Smith, Nicole Yakelovich are friends of theirs who were also at HP. So these people all moved. Did this work in 2002, a few years later. But it's the same interesting result, which is if you look, each horizontal line here is one day's work. And what you'll see is that if you look at the sort of the periodicity, basically this person, this is one person, started roughly at 5:30 in the morning. That's a weekend, right? And you see another weekend there, and so on. So you see this incredible periodicity in the different kinds of activities. Now, what's interesting to note here is that here at January 7th, so this is a discontinuous marker right here, this white line. Here, the person switched from being in the office to working at home. So notice that everything here is shifted. So this person now starts working at 4:30 in the morning. Yeah. So it's also interesting they quit a little bit earlier, but the truth is this person is working more hours at home than at work. Also notice here, if you look here, there's kind of a vertical gap here. So that means there's no activity during those gray periods. His computer was alive and connected, but not actually doing anything during that gray time. That's around 7:30. Guess what? Breakfast. And you can see this if you look at the average activity. See that big dip right there? So you get these incredibly precise. I mean, look at this. This is within 5 to 10 minutes of each morning, basically exactly the same period. Okay? So this kind of rhythmic pattern is incredibly important, especially when you get to things like email. So now I have to tell you, this particular study is what they call an email rhythms study. That is, the periodic behavior of people. Now, this was before it was really easy to study quantitatively large numbers of people. So if I was to do this same study now, I would have an N of, say, 1 million or 40,000 at least. I would be studying Gmail, I would anonymize the data, and I would look at all this stuff. And I would then fix for time zone and so on. But this was what they called a perception study. What it really means is that they went and talked to 40 different people, asking them about their perceptions. Now, later, you'll see, remember this picture from before? This is a few years later when they actually were able to quantify each and every email being sent. But back then, when this original paper was written, this was before that was a simple thing to do. So, just telling you, okay? But what's interesting about this paper, nonetheless, here we go, is that it was asking how people perceived their responsiveness or the responsiveness of their collaborators. So in essence, what this does is it allows us to understand how people feel about this thing. So the research questions, that is this thing right here, the RQs, is really asking questions about how often do you check your email? How often is your email prioritized as an important thing to do? How often do you use advanced features, and so on. The important thing here is how are delays managed? That is, when someone doesn't respond, or you are delayed in responding, and the perceptions of other people's responsiveness. Okay? So that's difficult to get from quantitative study. So this is actually quite a good study to do, to understand how people feel about and respond to the going back and forth in email. Now, here's what they found. So the study works like this. You find 40 people, in this case at HP. You interview them all about all these different things, and they do semi-structured interviews. Fine. This is what they found. First, individual users, each person by themselves, as considered as an individual, has a very typical pattern of responsiveness. There's also a general overarching pattern of responsiveness, but we'll see there's a kind of style, a kind of response style for using email. And there's also a kind of individual characteristic. We'll get to that in a second. Individuals, however, work to build what's called a responsiveness image. Now, Irving Goffman, a while ago, was a sociologist and wrote about people doing performances for other people. This is actually a really deep idea. When you express yourself in a medium, no matter what that medium is, if it's email or telephone calls or Snapchat or whatever, what you're doing is you are implicitly creating a social image. Remember we talked earlier before about creating a social identity in social media? This is the same idea except written in a kind of a larger stage. This is also true for email responsiveness. So people work hard to have a particular kind of responsiveness image. That is, if you send messages to Dan, to me, I expect that I will respond within, a day or so. So I'm not one of these really fast people. And that brings up the word on the left-hand side, parasynchronously. You see over here in the orange? It means not quite synchronously, but really fast. There are some people, I don't think this is true much anymore, but there are some people, okay, there were some people, who when in email would answer almost immediately. You'd send a message and bang, an answer would come back. You send another message, they'd be all, it was like they were using email like their personal instant messaging system. So the way you use Facebook Messenger, for example, is the way some people, would have this very parasynchronous, very fast turnaround time in order to create the image that they're always online, always paying attention to you. So in particular, one of the things they found was that people will use context cues to explain responsiveness in others. What this means is the context cues are things they know about the social setting, things they know about the individual, or evidence they've gathered from other sources of information in the context to say, oh, John didn't reply to me today because I know he's on vacation, or I know he's at an offsite, or I know that he's working really hard on a project. So you create an explanation to understand why a person is not responding in an appropriate amount of time to you. Now, people also don't use email in isolation. That is, it's part of a communications web of things that they use. So this is true, right? You don't use email and you do not use SMS or WhatsApp or Facebook or whatever. All these different communication media combine. So that was an important thing because people will switch media types, communication types, depending on both what their responsiveness image that they want to portray is, and the availability, and they know the responsiveness patterns of others. For example, my daughter is very responsive on WhatsApp, but it takes her about 5 hours, 6 hours to respond to my emails. She's a typical college student. She's just like you. And so, when I want to get a hold of her, I send her a WhatsApp message, or I SMS her or something. I typically don't try to email her. Now, my wife, I would email because I know she pays attention to that. So email and all these other communication media work together, and we understand how people respond in each of the different channels. Now, like I said, some people use email parasynchronously. This is typically people who have grown up in an email culture. and or are in a situation where they need to have a record of what's going on, that is, the transaction back and forward between the two people, and they need to work on it very, very quickly. So, for example, people in a war room would do this. So, just to define my term, a war room is when, for example, at Google, we have a war room when there's a serious situation that comes up. Something needs to be fixed right now. And so we put a bunch of people in a room, and they will often do that kind of very rapid backwards and back and forth parasynchronously in order to get progress on a particular topic. Finally, the finding is that people will reciprocate the email behavior of others. What that means is you tune your email, your response behavior to the expectation of other people. So, for example, again, using my wife and my daughter as an example, I expect my wife to respond very quickly. And if she doesn't, then I make an inference that she's driving or she's somehow unavailable. If my daughter doesn't reply quickly, I don't think anything of it. And so I tend to respond to her, my daughter, more slowly than I respond to my wife. That is, I reciprocate the email behaviors of others, of the recipient. Does that make sense? Because what you see is that people are modeling themselves with respect to their correspondent. And guess what? People have anxiety about everything. So when you develop a new email relationship or create a new email correspondent, you often, they found in their studies that people have anxiety about it. They will worry about it. And so what happens is that people start to try to, initially especially when they're trying to set up a relationship with someone else over email, they're trying to figure out, how does this person behave, how do they respond? Okay. In essence, what they're trying to suggest here is that people will send messages, that is the action taken on the left-hand side there, is they'll send a message and they will expect a response within a certain period of time. Same thing, again, with SMS or Snapchat or Instagram or whatever. You create a message, you send it out, and then you expect a response. So if, for example, I post something to Facebook and nobody responds within 12 hours, my expectation is that something's really broken. Maybe there's been a nuclear war. I don't know what's going on. But I get this perception of a breakdown after a certain period of time, and so you then create a follow-up. That was one of their big findings from this. People form expectations about when the response will be given, when it will arrive, and if that doesn't happen, then they do something to try to figure out what's going on. It's informal debugging is what it is, but it's in a social medium, so they will do this follow-up. For example, switching to a different communication medium like calling someone. Now, going back to that work by Bo Bagol, John Tong, and so on, back on the work rhythm thing, this is an interesting analysis because it shows the amount of variation between the amount of, so the black line here is the total volume. It's the activity within email. So you can see it goes up, and then there's a break here at lunchtime, right? And what you see here actually is a relatively narrow band. This is what I want to point out. See this relatively narrow band? So if you average over a month, people tend to follow this pattern almost religiously. So this person, for example, never sends email after 8:30 at night or before 5:45 in the morning. Never, ever, ever, right? Whereas this person here, number 2, and B, goes home or does something and then takes a break religiously every day. So the variation there is, the volume is 0 and the variation is 0, but then they get back onto their email platform after that. Okay? So there is this rhythm to life. There is rhythm to social communication. I want you to remember this. Keep this in the back of your head because some of you might want to do a study of rhythm for your data analysis project. Okay? Just remember that. Now, the way a lot of these papers work is that they will present the problem, the research question. They will then collect data, and they will analyze it. So the third section is analyzing it and then presenting some results, right? The fourth section in a lot of human-computer interaction papers is this design implications section. And in this paper, in Tong, Bagol et al., they have this design implications, which is to somehow signal unclosed threads. That is, I send you a message and you write back, and that's not closed. I mean, I should reply to you in order to close that thread, right? So what Google does, if you click on Sent Mail, so this tab right here, Sent Mail, so this is my inbox, and yes, I know, I've got 22,000 emails in my inbox. Deal with it. But I also have a bunch of sent mail, and if I click on the Sent Mail tab, I will see all the mail is sent, in this case, from yesterday. And what you see here is there's one message that's in bold. This is a signal that this is an unclosed thread. So that's a message to my wife asking about payment confirmation for something or other. And so I wrote to her, she wrote to me. So there's 3 transactions here. And then she wrote back, and I have not replied to her yet. So that's signaling that I have not responded to her yet. Okay, you see what I'm saying? It's this responsiveness expectation, and this is one way to signal that this is a response that's being expected. Okay, enough. So Gmail does it that way. Okay, so you got that? The big point of that paper is that response patterns are user perceptions. We can look at the logs and see what people really do, but we have to ask people to get this qualitative understanding about how people expect response patterns to go. Okay, that's true in social media, it's true in email, it's true in all this kind of online social stuff. Okay, let's go to our second paper for today, which is this paper on social capital and Facebook. Now, this is Moira Burke and Bob Kraut at CMU. Now, a little bit of background. Bob Kraut has been doing this kind of work forever. He is one of the grand old men of the field. He's got a bigger, whiter beard than I do. And Cameron Marlowe is at Facebook. And so what they did is they got together and they did this study about how participating in different Facebook activities influences the way we should be analyzing their behaviors. So the key idea here is that when you use a social site, say Facebook or name your favorite site, it's not all the same. That is, you have different behaviors depending on what you're doing. And that different behaviors have different kinds of consequences. So in particular, the way you use Facebook, guess what? It affects your social capital. So in particular, on Facebook, you can do one-to-one messaging, right? You can use Facebook Messenger, and you can send a message to a friend or so on. Or you can broadcast it as you make a post and send it to everybody who's going to see your connection. And you can, third behavior is you can passively consume. You can just sit there and read through them, right? Now, it turns out that there are lots of individual differences among the users. And, no surprise, those individual differences matter to the people involved. So if I, for example, am a heavy passive consumer, that is predictive of the kind of person I am and the way I consume all media. As opposed to somebody who spends all their time on Facebook Messenger sending one-to-one, send a message to you or just to 2 friends or something like that. That's a very different person. It also is a very different way of using them. So the question, the research question of the paper is that these different types of uses influence different types of social capital. Okay. So they're going to use Facebook in this differential analysis of the kinds of ways people use it to see if it affects social capital. Now, on the left-hand side there, bridging social capital. Remember these terms from a couple lectures ago? Bridging social capital is the creation of weak ties between people, not necessarily deep, emotional, intense relationships, as opposed to bonding social capital, which is this creation of tightly knit bonds, very close emotional and social relationships. And finally, there's maintained social capital, which is from earlier relationships in your life. or over time. So, for example, if you're in grad school, you may maintain social relationships with people from undergraduate or gymnasium or whatever, right? So, as I said, what they did on Facebook is to study these three different kinds of activities: directed one-to-one activities, passive consumption, and broadcast. All makes sense, right? So just to ground this, I'm showing you my Facebook page from this morning, actually. So over here on the right-hand side, you see my messenger with my daughter. So that's a one-to-one communication. This is a broadcast message. So my friend Anna Runlund put out this message about some fish doing some interesting thing. You've seen this before, right? So it's no surprise to you. And then, of course, just FYI, a bunch of ads over here as well. So one of the things they found in this study is that individual differences matter. And no surprise, personality traits influence the amount of time you spend online, that is, as opposed to somebody who spends less time as a fraction of their day online. And that's highly correlated with the level of introversion. That is, are you an introvert or an extrovert? Now, they're using this in the sort of very careful technical psychological definition of an introvert being, somebody who's interested more in internal things that are going on and less in externalities and other people in particular. So introverts tend to spend more time online on the social media. They also have personality traits also influence the way you spend that time online, how much time you spend reading versus writing and so on. So those are two different things. One is overall time. The second is the breakdown of individual behaviors online. So here's the data. Okay, so let's kind of look at this in some detail. I forgot what their sample size was. It was fairly large. I'm looking at it right now. It's like a couple thousand, as I recall. So I'm flipping through here. What's the N? 1,100. They had 1,193 people in this study. And so this is a very typical data table. Now notice that the individual differences here, this is aggregated over a 2-month period when they tracked these 1,100 people. And you get the standard demographic information at the top, age, gender, and so on. The friend count is interesting here because the median is 171. Standard deviation is 288. So this is a huge spread. So this is not your typical nice, smooth Gaussian curve. This is very variable. So what it means is that there were some people in this sample size who had very few friends, 6 friends. And there are people like you who have 1,000 friends. And so that's what makes that spread so big. But interestingly, time spent a day, it's less than 2 hours. And that's pretty consistent. Standard deviation here is, again, quite large. But from studies that we've done of social networking, this is actually, when was this paper published? This is published in 2011. That number has only gone up in the past few years. So this paper was published 6 years ago. And guess what? The amount of time people spend on social media sites has gone up since then. Yeah, I don't know how many hours you spend online every day on a social media site, but it's we know that the amount of time people spend on social media sites like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and so on is the single largest amount of time on any media on, say, your phone or your laptop. So on most people's phones, it turns out to be roughly a third of their day on average, which, anyway, I'm just saying, this is really important stuff because it takes a huge amount of time. And this is at the beginning of this sort of boom of these things. Okay, let's look at this. So, so if you're now looking at directed communication scale, so this is directed communication coming into you. So if you've got this graph of people, these are messages from other people to you, as opposed to the second area region here, which is messages going out. Okay, so look at this. The median is 41 messages coming in, and let's ignore comments and stuff for a second, but 56 going back out, 56 distinct friends. Okay, With 56 distinct friends, you're sending this in general again. 127 is the median, and 232 is the average. So guess what? There's a skew there as well. There are some people who send a bizarrely large number of messages. What this is all saying is that people are super active here, and they have very, very different ways of behaving. So that's the active component. That's both outward directing to friends, like you see here, distinct as friends to communicated with, versus wall posts, which are these sort of broadcast things, right? The broadcast things are far lower in number, overall quantity, than direct, right? So that sort of makes sense. A social network is defined by the sociality of it. That is, the friends, the kind of relationships you have on it. It's not the mass media network, okay? Okay, now look at this. So this is communication in, this whole block right here. This is communication out, and this is passive consumption, okay? So this is the broadcasts you're seeing from other people. So if you see here, the number of stories clicked and the numbers of stories reloaded and so on is really huge. What this tells me is that people are spending a lot of time reading in social media. They're looking at a fair number of profiles, a fair number of distinct photos, but not as many as you might think. Last bucket here is the broadcasting scale. So this is looking for how often people post to their wall, or generally sending out to the universe at large. So status updates like, I'm feeling hungry because I'm in, downtown San Francisco. A status update like that. This is over 2 months, really? 41, so that's like every other day, roughly. Okay, that's the mean number. And here, the variance, the standard deviation is not so big. So what you're seeing here is the first hint, really, that there are sort of protocols and standards and expectations. Now, you know as well as I do that it's not okay for you to send, say, 29 Instagram posts a day. Nobody does that, right? And if you think about it and you talk to your friends, you'll start to see the emergence of these expectations of social norms. How often do you broadcast? How often do you send a direct post? Because we have all had friends who post too much, right? And that's what you're starting to see in this data. So I love this paper partly for this, partly because it's starting to talk about how people develop social capital in these things. And this is just another one about the relationship between directed communications in and out. Okay, fine. Here are the big findings. No surprise, inbound and outbound messages directed are highly correlated. That's just like email, or just like SMS or something. No surprise. But what is a surprise is that inbound messages predict bridging social capital. Remember bridging social capital? Bridging social capital is creating weak ties between people for information. This is not the deep social connection. Okay? So the number of inbound messages you have predicts the degree of bridging social capital you have. Whereas outbound messages has no correlation with your bridging social capital. So it's an asymmetric correlation. Inbound messages affect the bridging social capital that an individual has, whereas the number I send out does not. That's not intuitive exactly, but it does correlate with the sort of intuitive belief that people who get lots of messages are highly liked by and have social capital with other people. Whereas if you're sending stuff out, there's no prediction that outbound messages do anything. They may not create social capital. So the point is that only directed communications, and this is the fourth big point, only directed communications has an impact on bridging social capital. So there are all these interactions here between people with, they also measured the sort of social communication skill level. And what you're seeing here are 3 charts comparing people with low communication skills and high communication skills. You can read the paper to figure out how they define that. But comparing them, and what's interesting here is if you look in this first chart, if you measure the bridging social capital, and again, they've got a definition in the paper, but it's basically quantifying the bridging social capital you have. People with high communication skills, right, if they have low numbers of directed communications, that is, they're not having many come in or out, guess what? They have lower social capital. But importantly, it's higher than people who have low social capital. I'm sorry, low communication skills. Okay? So there's not a surprise here that higher communication skilled people are better at bridging social capital than low communication skilled people. It's also interesting how robust that is over time. Now, this is the surprising chart, the passive consumption one in the middle. This is funny because it means that for people who are only passively consuming, not only, but largely passively consuming content, if they are low in their amount of that is, they don't consume it passively often, then guess what? They have a bigger difference between people with high communication skill. This chart in the middle is worth looking at. As opposed to people with high degree of passive consumption with low communication skill, they're almost the same as their friends who have high communication skills. Okay? So people who don't consume passively a lot of information, if they're already high performers, that is, really skilled at communication, then it doesn't matter. It makes no difference. This line is totally flat, right? On the other hand, people who have low communication skills, if they consume a lot passively, they grow their social capital. That's not obvious why that happens. Anyway, the other two charts are pretty much what you'd expect, but I found this one, the passive consumption increases people with low communication skills. It increases their bridging capital. Fascinating result. Okay, we've got a couple minutes left. Let's talk about this third paper. Reflect back on that last paper, which is the social capital, that is in particular bridging social capital, tells you a lot about the way people use Facebook and the amount that they use it or create or just read passively. Now, let's look at this for a second, because this is an important paper. The strength of weak ties paper comes from 1973, before any of us were born, right? I mean, this is back in the 70s, and yet this was this is the era of what was called sociometrics and sociograms. And so the key thing here was that the studies that they were doing at that time were laying the groundwork for the social media platforms of today. In particular, this paper is talking about the strength of weak ties. The question here, the research question here, do social ties come in different strengths? Are there weak ones? Are there strong ones? And if so, what does it mean? Are weak ties important? Well, you can tell by the paper that it's probably going to be important. But let's look at this. So Mark Granovetter is a guy who, at the time when he wrote that paper in 73, had just finished his PhD at Johns Hopkins. And now he's Department of Sociology at Stanford, so he's just down the street from us here. But I want you to look at this. This paper here, this is from Google Scholar. This is that paper, The Strength of Weak Ties. Okay? Cited by 42,000 other people. That's not a mistake. That means that this is a super, super influential paper. I mean, I would kill to have that number, right? But no, so what's even better is that a few years later he wrote this paper, Economic Action and Social Structure. 34,000. I mean, this guy is just a machine. My deep point here is that this is part of the reason we're studying this. Because this work that he did grew out of some work that he was doing on his PhD with his advisor. His advisor was Steve Harrison. And his advisor had been working on sociograms and how people are connected. And that focus of that work was all about strong ties. Now, that makes sense because your intuition says that your strong ties define your social community, right? Your good friends, your job, your employment relationships, your friend relationships, your family relationships, those are all strong ties, right? So that makes sense. Then Mark Granovetter comes along and starts studying all these things, and he's breaking out the strong ties and the weak ties, and he noticed something in his data. He noticed that people with lots of weak ties tended to have really effective kinds of behaviors that nobody would have predicted. And in particular, what he was studying was the economics and behaviors associated with people getting jobs. And the thing he discovered in his data, was that people with strong ties were getting more employment opportunities through their weak ties, that is, through their distant connections, than through their strong ties. What? That makes no sense. And yet, the data is non-controversial. It's a fascinating result. So, let's talk about what a tie means. Granovetter and everybody before him has defined a tie or link or relationship at this time in the 70s as the amount of time spent on the relationship, the emotional intensity, and reciprocal services. That is, oh, I do something for me, then you do something for me, for you. So if I get you a cup of coffee, you'll get me one later, right? You scratch my back, I scratch yours. That's a reciprocal service. So they've always defined it in terms of the amount of time you spend and how deeply connected you are. Notice, a tie can be positive, like my best friend, or it can be negative, my worst enemy, right? I have a tie, I have a strong tie to that person. I hate them, but I have a strong tie to them, okay? So it's important. Now, in his paper, he introduces this concept of weak ties and strong ties, and in particular, one of the key concepts in this paper is that what he called the forbidden triad. So you've got three people who have relationships here. A and B have a strong link, and A and C have a weak link. Now, in his paper, the first half of the paper basically makes this argument that this tie actually is forbidden. And what he means by that is that if you look at this, so that A-B relationship is a strong tie, and this AC relationship is a weak tie. It's forbidden because if A has a strong tie to B, then and A has a tie to C, then there is implicitly a weak tie from B to C. Now, it's not forbidden in the sense that it's impossible to happen. I think he overstated the case. It's improbable because if Alice knows Bobby and Alice knows Charlie, then it's pretty likely that Bobby knows Charlie. That's what this is saying, right? So it's not forbidden. It's just improbable that no weak link would exist like that. Now, this is interesting because as we go forward in time, and we get to our project in just a few minutes, we're going to be talking about the effects and doing analysis with networks like this. In his paper, he establishes what he calls the concept of a bridge, a local bridge. So if you look here, for example, at let's look at figure A up here. So see A links to B. That's a local bridge between these two people. And this is a bridge between E and I. Now, do I have a diagram? Oh, shoot. What I was hoping for. Imagine for a moment that this upper line does not exist. Okay. Then, sorry, this upper line does not exist between E and I. Then you have two groups, the A, D, E, C, F group, which is disconnected except for this bridge to this other group, B, H, J, and G. Right. So that's a bridge between two otherwise isolated groups. And in this case, there are two bridges between E and I and A and B. So the reason this is important is that if D wants to connect, say, to H, the only path here is through AB. Okay? Why is this important now? Because of things like LinkedIn. LinkedIn is explicitly all about making these bridges. It's all about connecting subgraphs. So, for example, I'm part of the graph, say the left-hand side of the A diagram here, of all my friends at Google. And over here, I now have bridges to people over in Facebook. LinkedIn makes these links, sorry, this is hard to say. LinkedIn as a product makes these linkages explicit. And it's, for example, if I wanted to make a connection to, I don't know, Tim Berners-Lee, right? If I wanted to connect to Tim Berners-Lee, I'm 99% sure I can figure out who the local bridge is that connects my piece of the social graph to that piece. One of the big points of this paper is that no strong tie is a bridge because of the forbidden triad, right? If you've got for example, this link here between A and B is a strong tie, then there's implicitly links between D and B as well. So there would be another linkage here, is what I'm saying. So this paper makes the interesting observation that the strength of ties determines the kind of topology of the network. Fascinating, right? It matters because of this deep observation, which started off the paper. Weak ties predict employment opportunities. So in particular, yeah, let's look at this one. Sorry, I've got the same slide in here twice. If you look at the weak connections, like this one right here, if this person, this blue dot, is looking for a job, most often people find employment opportunities through their weak ties, not their strong ties. This is deeply counterintuitive. I would expect my thesis advisor to help me find a job. I would expect the guy I see once a week down at the sandwich shop to have a job connection for me. But that's the way it works out. And part of it is because you have more weak ties than strong ties. That makes sense. You have more people that you see occasionally or rarely. So in this sample, it's what, 82%. 82% of all my ties are with weak ties. So just probabilistically, if somebody knows in that set of 82% of all my connections that I'm looking for a job, it's probable that that's going to be the way I get it. But there's also kind of a social thing, which is many of your weak ties are with people you currently work with or your family. And those are not often productive of new job opportunities. So they're not only weak versus strong, but they're also qualitatively different. They connect you to a different kind of community. Truthfully, you don't often get jobs from your family. And if you're in one employment place, the chances are quite good that you'll leave another to go to another employment place. I might leave, I'm making this up, but I might leave Google to, say, go to Bing or Microsoft or Facebook or something, right? And so the strong ties I have within my local work community don't help me get that job, okay? So this was an interesting observation that came out of the data. Now, in the paper, there's this speculation. I put it in the upper left corner there. There's a maximum distance beyond which the effect can travel. Now, this is, he was talking with respect to employment, but I think this is more generally true. Later, we will find exactly the degree to which this is true. But it's interesting to note that even in 1973, they were thinking about this maximum distance effect. Okay? I'm going to take 30 seconds and summarize this next paper, and I'll come back to it later, but I want to give you the big idea here. So these folks, Leskovec, Huttenlocher, and Kleinberg, are all at Stanford and Cornell. And they, remember we talked about friends versus enemies in your social network? Yeah, this is work about that. So what they've done is basically broken down this analysis into these basic triangles. So a lot like the forbidden triad you saw earlier, because that's the sort of minimum component you can use to do this graph analysis. And they started to try to analyze it in terms of both positive and negative relationships, and they created this whole typology. So it's what, 5 o'clock there now, right? So let's take a quick 5-minute break, because I need a break, and I think you might need a break. But let's come back at exactly 5 minutes, because I want to get to our next section here. Yeah, we'll talk about this in the next section. Okay? So let's do this. Let's take a quick 5-minute break, and I also want to do a sound check while I'm chatting with you. Okay? All right, team? Okay, thanks. I'll be back. Don't go away.
Vamos lá depois. Vamos lá depois.
All right.